Hello and welcome to another episode of Just Two Dads, along with Sean Francis. I am Brian Altunian. We're episode 205. And if you've ever heard of a term called the disability tax, or if you have any idea what that means, we're going to have a conversation about that and many other things today as it relates to the differences between abled and, I hate using the word disabled, but abled and disabled folks, and really the impact and how we can change the concept around that across the globe, across so many different things. I'm really fumbling this introduction, but that's only because I'm overwhelmed by the talent that we've got here today in Tiffany Yu. We're very excited and think you're going to enjoy today's episode of Just Two Dads. Hello, and thank you boy, I'm really off today. I don't know what's going on today, but that's all right. This is life as it's coming at us as it's coming at us. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Just Two Dads. I'm Brian Altunian along with Sean Francis. We started this podcast about 4 years ago in order to shine the light on amazing folks who are supporting the special needs community, advocates, people who have contributed a lot of their time and effort and energy to support the community, whether they're a part of the community or not. And we have been honored and blessed to be really graced with the presence of some really amazing folks lately, and today's no exception. So we're going to get right into it. I want to thank Billy Footwear for all of his support, all the support that they give us. Billy Footwear creates adaptive footwear for people of all ages, sizes, and abilities. And the story of Billy Price, the CEO, is fascinating. Go to billyfootwear.com and we'll get into the other thank yous later. We know you have a lot of choices when it comes to podcasts, and we are grateful that you're going to spend some time with us. We believe today, along with some of our really great episodes we've had lately, you're going to find some really great value in today's episode with Tiffany. So to get into it and introduce Tiffany to all of you, we're going to hand it over to Sean Francis. Sean, you ready to rock and roll, buddy?
That I am. My biggest task is trying to, acknowledge the gratitude I have for the opportunity we have with this platform, and at the same time giving the due respect to our guest today, who is a warrior personified. I feel like everything that I'm going to look for in order to explain who she is going to sell her short. So I'm just going to jump right into it. And welcome to Just Two Dads, Tiffany Yu, author of the book, The Anti-Ableist Manifesto. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I can go through the list, by the way, Sean. There's on Tiffany's website. I'm just going to read really quickly.
Please do.
Speaker, content creator, social impact entrepreneur, diversity and inclusion community builder, inclusion and empowerment advocate, and most importantly, your biggest fan. Love that description. I think it's beautiful. I think it describes you so well. So with that, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Yes. You have another multi-hyphenate.
There you go. And ordinarily, if you look, anyone that's familiar with our show knows that we generally begin with, acknowledging that the guest in most cases is someone that is a hero. One of the first qualifications for a hero is not believing that you are one, just doing what you do, being who we are. We've been working with a media consultant lately where we've sort of flipped that around and not necessarily began with that. But I think that based on the book and your advocacy, beginning with your story, where you come from spiritually, physically, geographically, and everything, has everything to do with where we are today and where you are, including the book. So why don't we start with that?
Ooh, okay. If we rewind back, I am the youngest of four. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland. And my dad is an immigrant from Taiwan, and my mom is a refugee from the Vietnam War.
Wow.
And at the age of 9, my dad and a couple of my siblings and I, on a car ride home, he lost control of the car. Oh. He unfortunately passed away, and I acquired a handful of injuries and disabilities, including permanently paralyzing one of my arms. I broke a couple bones in one of my legs, so I would be a temporary wheelchair user for about 4 months as those bones healed. And much later, I'd be diagnosed with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So that all happened when I was 9 years old. And I think a lot about 9-year-old Tiffany. Actually, I've dedicated the book to 9-year-old Tiffany. And she essentially is the why behind all of my work. And I want to share that probably for the 10 plus years after I became disabled. And actually, the first chapter of the book is around how disability is not a bad word or a bad thing. It's totally fine to just say the word disability when talking about disabilities. But for the 10 plus years after I became disabled, I think partly influenced by being the daughter of Asian immigrants and my cultural upbringing, I had learned or I had internalized that the car accident, my dad passing away, and the fact that I now had both apparent and non-apparent disabilities, that I was bad luck. In certain East Asian cultures, everything, there's a reason why everything happens. Something in the ancestral lineage caused the bad luck to happen. And actually, I just had a piece on social media come out about this. Essentially, I emanated my belief, my internalized belief was that I was emanating this bad luck. It existed in this one body.
Oh my gosh.
It took me 10 plus years to kind of unlearn that. Horrific, tragic things happen because they do. Or, if you are a spiritual person, maybe I never want to shame people for the things that they believe in, and want to have compassion and curiosity for why they believe the things that they do. But I think that narrative wasn't serving me for a period of time. And I started to share my story. And I still remember the first time I ever shared the story of the car accident publicly. I was 21. So from 9 years old until 21, it was my secret. And that became the journey of Tiffany as a community builder, and Tiffany as a disability advocate, and Tiffany as your biggest fan.
Amazing.
Wow. I got to ask you. So anybody that's familiar with the show, you answered the question that we usually close the show with. How did you in terms of changing beliefs? Tell us, if you can, about the journey from, because if you're 9 years old and you believe that you are somehow responsible for that tragedy, that's quite the journey to arrive at the point where you realize that you obviously were not. Tell us about that.
Yeah, in that particular phrasing, I don't know if then in that immediate moment I felt like I was the reason for it. And I actually don't feel like I harbor any negative feelings toward my dad, and I also don't know if I felt any survivor's guilt, because when I say those words, they don't land with me. Sure. I think I just felt like the epitome of grief. And I talk about how the car accident to me was these multiple layers of grief. It was loss of a loved one, death grief, how most of us understand it to be. It was body grief or disability grief in terms of ability to use my body in this one way before, and then losing that. And that was my dominant hand. I used to be right hand dominant. And then loss a type of grief that I hope we spend more time talking about as a society, which is sometimes known as childhood trauma, the loss of childhood innocence, adverse childhood experiences. It's the grief of not being able to be a kid anymore. So I will share in full transparency that it actually was only as I was doing research at the intersection between being disabled and being Asian that I started to connect the dots around the belief in the ancestral lineage and kind of what gets carried through intergenerationally, and how, it's all viewed in terms of the household unit and this idea of bad luck. I only started to learn more about those once I started doing research about it and learning more about other people who are Asian and disabled and those cultural beliefs and how they had to unlearn those. So I think the shift, all of that I just said was just a lot of context, but I think part of it was actually really inspired by I didn't identify as Taiwanese or Asian until I was 18. And part of that, again, maybe influenced by being the daughter of Asian immigrants, I have a feeling that when my parents came to the US, they both have accents in the way that they speak English. English is maybe their third or fourth language, and is my only language. And I think about how I didn't, we were one of a few Asian families in the neighborhood that I grew up in. So that there weren't really other people I could talk to about being Asian.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I'm learning is that for my parents' generation, when they were immigrants here, they believed their pathway to success here was in America was through assimilation and erasure of our race. And so during Lunar New Year, I would get a red envelope, but I didn't know what it meant, right? So there was also not really this like carrying through of these cultural celebrations and the significance and meaning behind them. So when I was 18 years old, I was a freshman in college, and I met another student at freshman orientation, and she told me that her mom was from Taiwan. And I told her my dad was from Taiwan. You're trying to find those points of similarity.
Sure. Yeah.
And and I said, "Oh, my dad's from Taiwan. We should start a club." And she actually took that and she ran with it. And together we became the co-founders with a group of other Taiwanese American students. We became the co-founders of Georgetown's first ever Taiwanese American student club.
Wow.
And as a function of creating that club, I gained a sense of pride, identity, culture, history, community in being Taiwanese American. And in some ways, I wish my dad could have seen who she became, who this Tiffany, who was proud of being Taiwanese American, who like couldn't wait to meet other Taiwanese students. So fast forward a couple years, now I'm a senior in college, and I kind of looked back at the ways that this club had really made me proud to be Taiwanese American. And I started to get curious about if I could explore a similar journey around being disabled. And that was the beginning of what many people now know to be Diversability, which is our nonprofit around building disability community and ending the cycle of social isolation for disabled people. But I will share that I saw myself as someone who knew how to start clubs or knew how to build community first before I found my voice as a disability advocate. I was just kind of like, okay, check the box, Taiwanese American, we did that. I know the steps to creating a club, so I'm going to do that, but around disability. And I think that was the beginning of the unlearning process.
At what point did you decide to write the book? We're going to put up here on the screen too, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto. Does that come out of all of this?
I feel like, so this year will mark 28 years since I became disabled. It will mark 16 years since I started to share my story and essentially became a disability advocate. And I want to say the culmination of almost 30 years of existing in this disabled body and 15 plus years of being in the disability community potentially culminated in this book. This book is in response to the question, how can I show up better for the disability community? It's a question I get asked all the time, and people want that quick soundbite. But unfortunately, it's a 250-page book. But I will say the impetus for the book actually came from a series I have on social media called the Anti-Ableism series. I launched the Anti-Ableism series in December of 2020, again in response to the question, how can I show up better for the disability community? And it's a short form video series. So the series has over 300 parts now, and still counting. I have a lot in the backlog. I have a lot of respect for those who have podcasts because the amount of editing that I put into a 20-second video, I can only imagine when it's an hour long. But yeah, I started that series, and I will say that I actually did not set out to write a book. I was very fine kind of running our nonprofit, and I was creating content and loved kind of exploring creativity in that way and doing some speaking. And part of how we supported our nonprofit was I would go out and talk about disability inclusion in the workplace. My background, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, my background is actually in business, in finance and accounting. And I started my career in investment banking at Goldman Sachs and worked at places like Bloomberg and different startups. And I kind of looked at my corporate background and wondered if I could be a bridge between these advocacy spaces and this community that I was so deeply entrenched in and things that were going on in the corporate world and the ways that work is a place that we spend a third of our lives in and supports our livelihood and is where we feel like we contribute. But the book came about kind of unconventionally. Someone saw the social media series. They saw some of the things I was posting and they said, "Oh, have you ever thought about writing a book? Because I would love to represent you for a book you're going to write." And I said, "I have too much stuff going on. Haven't thought about writing a
Wow.
book." And
That's prophetic too, because a book you're going to write, not that you should write one.
ooh, well, I think his original message said, "Have you thought about writing a book?" And I said, "No, I don't have any time." And then he said, "Yeah." And then he said, "I want to represent you for a book you're going to write." And actually, previously, I had been on a podcast called "You Should Write a Book About That." And I got to meet her at my LA book signing. And I remember I signed it to her and then I wrote a book about this. But yeah, I think, to me, in the current attention economy that we're in, writing a book, it just felt like such a daunting task.
Yeah.
And I don't know if either of you have written a book or have aspirations to, but
We've
it
talked
is.
about
What's that?
I said we have talked about it many
Yes.
times.
It's
And
somewhere
we
in
want
there.
to, and it is daunting. Yes, that's why we haven't done that yet.
But yeah, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, the seed kind of sparked in 2021. That's when this literary agent reached out. And over the next year and a half or so, was kind of working on some different ideas. And this one came to the forefront. And we ended up getting something called a preempt, which means that the publisher just liked the idea so much they didn't need a finished proposal. They just wanted to make sure it could get out into the world. And as we're recording this, I think the book has been out for 8 months now.
Wow. Congratulations. Wow. That's amazing. And by the way, I'm going to put up on the screen, just to reiterate, the book is called The Anti-Ableist Manifesto, which again, I'll spell it, but we keep misspelling it. And the Anti-Ableist, ABLEIST, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto. And Tiffany has her own website, tiffanyyu.com. That's Tiffany Yu is YU. And you can get the book at her website at tiffanyyu.com/book. 8 months. And it is, I've read some excerpts and some of the stuff that's been written about the book. Fascinating, really amazing stuff. I want to go back to the thing that you mentioned about because I think our mental health, it's a mental health crisis in this country, partially due to the pandemic and other reasons, but just that sense of isolation and all of the other things that kind of come with that. You started to mention that. Can we chat about that a little bit? Sean, for those who can see us on video, Sean is showing Tiffany's website. Is there anything on the site, by the way, while we're looking at it, Tiffany, that people should be directed to?
Yeah, if you want to click on the book page, that's probably, I mean, this is the page I'm updating the most frequently. It'll have all the book events that I'm doing. You can get the book in hardcover, ebook, or audio. And then if you scroll down, it'll kind of just have like all of the press highlights and things like that. But yeah, I think to talk about mental health, I mean, one thing I think it's important to make a distinction around is that all of us have mental health. Some of us have what are called mental health disabilities or mental illnesses. And I think that, I actually do think that the pandemic helped open up a conversation more a little bit around destigmatizing mental health and the ways that level of isolation impacted us in one way or another. But part of why I do lead with talking about my disability origin story and sharing that I have a paralyzed arm, which is the disability you can see, but also live with a mental illness, is to, I think, maybe help contribute to the fact that I hope that more of us can get the support that we need. I will also share a mental health diagnosis is a privilege, but I wasn't diagnosed with PTSD until 2019. So the car accident was 1997, and that is a 22-year treatment gap, right? And I think on average for different mental health conditions, it's a 10-year treatment gap as well, right? And then I think if you add in a layer of men, it's probably even more. Some of the research I did is that in Asian American communities, we are 3 to 5 times less likely to seek out mental health support because, and this was part of my research too, mental health is not considered real in certain East Asian cultures, and mental illness is not considered a disability, right? So if something's not considered real or it's not considered a disability, you do not go out actively to not only seek a diagnosis and as a result are not getting the treatment that you need.
I was gonna ask you, literally like snatch the thought right out of my head. I was thinking, regardless of country, when someone comes from another country to the US to, you know, pursue the American dream, you know, you're facing a lot of things that you've left behind. And I was going to ask you if there was a cultural component to it, because you're very there's a stoic component to it where you kind of get on with things. You're here to conquer and make something of yourself and that kind of thing. And you answer that before, and I thought that's very, very interesting. And I think that bleeds into a lot of communities of color altogether, especially communities of color, and especially with men. And then if you have both, well, you know, then the odds are kind of stacked against you to even admit that, you know, you're afraid or you're uncertain or have a disability, whatever the case might be.
Yeah, I look at some, you know, I have some friends who are part of men's groups. I think one is called the Everyman. And I just think that, yeah, making, like, all of us have mental health. And if we can figure out more spaces, safe spaces to be able to be open about them, then again, I think more of us can get the support that we need.
Definitely.
Yeah, we've created a biweekly men's support group for fathers in the special needs community. We call it the Den. It's the place in home. That's the room in the house that, you know, you feel comfortable watching sports or whatever, and where guys feel comfortable and, you know, possibly being a little bit vulnerable, and the stories that we share and the support that we provide one another. Sean leads that men's group, and it's really been amazing to see those that come on a regular basis, to see how open they become after a period of time and able to discuss. So again, it's a segment of the population that is not normally in the conversation. And I think, as you just said, things like the pandemic forced us to start to, you know, engage in conversations that were not, because we all had sort of a common experience at that point. I think that's somewhat of a challenge, right? If we don't have a common experience, it's difficult many people who are parents of children with special needs feel that they're alone. People don't understand them, and they feel isolated. And until they find somebody who shares that common experience, you know, they're sort of reluctant to share. Once they find it, as I think you've discovered too, then the conversations can open up and begin to move the needle in one direction or another. I think it's fascinating what you've been doing.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about. So I was on another podcast that was actually focused on moms who have kids with disabilities, and I think it's called Brave Together. But
We Are Brave Together.
Yeah. We are brave together.
Yeah. So I was on their podcast, and I'm glad that I'm learning about this resource too, to be able to provide both of yours to parents who are moms and or dads. And yeah, I just think it's great that can, like, I think we're also realizing, you know, we're talking about mental health, but one of the things that the pandemic also taught us is that our overall well-being is this intersection between our mental health, our physical health, and our social health. And social health is this community, healthy relationships, and social connection, right? And so while we're spending this time talking about this intersection of our physical health and mental health, I think we're realizing we need community now more than ever, right? It can be, not only is it isolating to be a disabled person, it's isolating to be a dad of a disabled kid, you know, if you feel like you're the only one. And so part of the power is, once more of us find each other and we realize we're not alone, we can not only like share resources, but we're also leaning into kind of that social health component of our overall well-being too.
Yeah. With that, let's talk about ableism itself. I don't know if people necessarily know what that is. And I think if a person, how do I put this? I think it's easier for a person to be an obvious, while it can be covert, I think it's easier for a person to be a racist or sexist individual or have racist or sexist tendencies. But because ableism is not discussed as often, I think that one can be ableist, at least to me, in more of a sneaky and unconscious way or manner. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So the first I'll share that the first time ableism, the term, was ever used was 1981. And I was born in the
Wow.
80s, and I don't think I'm that old. And so it's actually fascinating to me that we didn't have the language to describe ableism until the 1980s. And if you
Crazy.
don't have language to describe the discrimination or the bias or the prejudice, then you have no way to dismantle it because you don't even know how to put words to it. You're being devalued or discriminated against. And so the definition that I use of ableism is that it's a system of oppression that devalues people based on the way their body and or mind works. The reason why I use that definition, and then I'll simplify it even more, but the reason why I use that definition is in that definition of ableism, this devaluing of a person based on the way their body and or mind works, is we see that devaluing happen based with women's bodies or Black bodies or any bodies of color, right? And you're seeing other, like you said, sexism and racism kind of intersect with ableism in those examples as well. So to simplify it even more, ableism to me is the devaluing of disabled bodies and or disabled minds. Part of how that shows up, and I would be interested to have a conversation around this, is even in the use of special needs to describe someone who has disabilities. Because even embedded in the idea of special needs, and I know that, special education and special needs, those are terms that have been around for a long time,
Right.
but I have a hard time believing that our access to education or basic human rights or the ability to go to a concert are special. Or maybe going to a concert, that can be like extra credit, or access to healthcare are considered special needs, right? Those seem like fundamental human rights.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, even that phrase special needs is highlighting the devaluing we have around disabled bodies and or disabled minds by saying we feel so uncomfortable with this word disability that we're going to call it special. But getting your access to the things that you need, to me, is not special. And I have a friend who jokes, her name's Lachi. She's a blind musician. She says, if you really want to know about my special needs, you can DM me.
You know what?
We talk about it all the time, that conversation around the label and disabled. I've said this to Sean, it feels like, you can have if your car breaks down, you're disabled, right? Because there's ability and there's the disability. And so disability to me connotes broken or broken down, right? And special needs, we always say special needs at some point in life, we're all going to need some sort of additional support,
accommodation or something,
things that everybody else has access to as we age, as our eyesight's, our ability to drive and get around, have needed a wheelchair in some cases, as you mentioned. We're going to need additional support and accommodations to do what, I would say neurotypical or physically able bodies can do. And so we hear you. And then I think that I still don't think that there's a consensus as to what's the best term to describe the umbrella of people that fall into this category.
Yeah.
Well, my son is 19. We've been doing this. He was diagnosed with autism at 3. We've been doing this podcast for 4 years, maybe almost 5. The word ableist or ableism is 5 years old or less to me. We've had this conversation about what words are best, and some people get real upset. I'm sorry, you were going to say something as well.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah. I'm sorry, Tiffany. Yeah, you were good. Yeah.
No, I'd be interested to hear you finish your thought.
Just that, at least for me, I kind of, well, there's several of them. Like, for instance, I didn't see myself as a caregiver. I thought I associated caregiving with someone who's caring for the elderly. So, one of the reasons I'm grateful for this platform is because we continue to evolve and grow. And I think that you at least go on instinct when you're speaking with someone, but my thought is always, how would you prefer I refer to the term or address you? And I think it's kind of hard to be wrong if we, if we take that path, just by asking, because some people are very, very upset if one thing is not used, and then they feel that should be used for everyone else as well. But I think it goes back to everything we talk about, which is what disabilities, special needs, and caregiving allows one to do, which is be reminded that everybody, in the most basic of ways, needs the same thing: to be seen, heard, loved, and know that they count and matter.
Yeah. I think a couple thoughts come to mind. I'll share a story that I thought was interesting. So I have a friend who has a disability that impacts her ability to sit for long periods of time. And she was going on a flight and I think needed a special cushion or something. And she told the flight attendant that she had challenges. And I remember getting like a ton of calls from her because she was so frustrated because she needed this special seat for this, international flight. And I asked her, I said, did you tell them that you have a disability? And she said, no, because I feel uncomfortable with that word. And so I told them I had challenges. And I said, well, in that particular context, if you told them you have a disability that impacts your back, they have to try to make a reasonable accommodation, and may have understood a little bit better how to better serve you or figure out, how you can make it through the flight by not experiencing as much pain. So I think about the ways that our rights are also enshrined by identifying as disabled. And you'll see there are a lot of people within the disability community who are reclaiming the word disability, right? Brian, I think I had to unlearn that disability meant broken, because I don't want to go around feeling like I'm broken because something that's broken needs to be fixed, right? And if 61 million of us here in the US have a disability, or a billion of us globally, why don't we fix our external environment, right? And make it so that we can show up in a space, right? And so that was kind of the first point. And then the second point was around, Sean, your idea. Disability is not a monolith, right? So anything you read in my book, there will be someone who disagrees with it. I think part of it is, how do I take an anti-ableist lens toward this around the language that we use? Because if I think about the book, even in the context of a book, the book is available in print, in ebook, and in audiobook. That can be seen as accommodations depending on, how people engage in text. But I don't see it as special, right? We've made it all available for people so that they can engage in the text in the best way that works for them. So I don't know if glasses are special, or if having the book in an audio format is special. But yeah, it's this ongoing conversation around language. And I will share. So I did do. I'll share two kind of tidbits from the book that you'll get to read about. One is, a lot of people will tell me about their discomfort with the word disability, because to them, they associate it with lack of ability. And in my research, I also saw that dis is associated with the prefixes bis and duo. So essentially, disability could be just another way of being or doing. And I appreciated that. And I think even in my own learning, I didn't identify as disabled until I think I was in my 20s, right? So, but I also look back, and perhaps this is cultural. I found out in my 30s that I could have been eligible for an IEP, an individualized education plan, which both of you are very, very familiar, because I was writing with my non-dominant hand, and taking essays. And what was interesting was I shared that in an event I was doing, and someone in the audience said, the school should have offered that to you. It was your right. But maybe my mom decided that she didn't want me to have something that was special, which was, but Tiffany, looking back at 9 years old, having to relearn how to write with my non-dominant hand and take tests in the same amount of time, I also look back and I think it didn't have to be so hard. if they
right.
just if they gave me the tools that I needed, then I could have figured out a way to do it. And I'll also share, I wrote the entire first draft of this book using speech to text technology.
Oh my
it's
gosh.
a little bit of a different way to write this book, right? But I also wanted this book to feel like it was me talking to you. But for someone who only types with one hand, writing a 90,000 word book probably would have a very negative impact on my one hand, And so it's like, let me figure out a way that I can do this in the way that works best for me. And can I share one last thing on this?
Of course.
Which
is as many as you wish.
I talk about inclusive design in the book. And the definition of inclusive design is multiple design variations so long as you have the same desired outcome. Multiple design variations, same desired outcome. I do a lot of work around disability in the workplace. Desired outcome is you get your work done. Multiple design variations. Like inclusive design to me is a form of accommodation. And so I think about how Tiffany, her accommodation was that she needed to use speech to text to write this book, but you still get a book, right? Desired outcome is you get all the information.
Yeah.
Multiple design variations. I could have either typed it. I could have, I don't know. Other people have different ways of writing books.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, you still get the book, right? And I even think about how we talked about like print, audio, ebook, multiple design variations. Desired output is the information in the book. And so for me, I view accommodations not necessarily as something special, but a form, like a creative way to think about how we design different environments so that people can equitably participate in the things that they want to do.
No.
And
I was thinking about.
Go ahead, Brian. You go ahead.
As you were talking about the diagnosis, and again, the idea that if the school didn't acknowledge because you had a physical limitation and they didn't offer the IP, I immediately thought about those children who grow up with dyslexia and not being able to identify what that actually is and how it manifests. And sometimes they just, they get marked down in, school credits and whatnot, because it's not a something that you can see. It's not a visible disability, if you will. And so, there are probably a lot of those sort of invisible, ailments that folks live with or grow up with, and there's no way to provide all those accommodations. And what you're talking about is multiple designs to be as inclusive to accommodate as many people as possible, right? That's ultimately good.
I think one thing I feel excited about is whether it's social media. I think we just have so much more information. Not only do we have so many more role models, which I think is really important to have in, all different, so many disabled role models in all these different areas. But now I feel like the diagnostic tools are a lot better, that people are equipped more and maybe like stronger self-advocates or patient advocates. Because I also look at Richard Branson is dyslexic. He is who I would consider probably one of the most successful disabled entrepreneurs. And he actually is very outspoken about what he calls dyslexic thinking. And it forced him to become a stronger leader, think more creatively. And even, when I was working at the investment bank, the president of the bank at the time was also dyslexic. And this had been written about publicly about how, it would take him like a longer period of time to read an essay or something, and the different ways that he figured out how he could make work better for him so that it wasn't dependent on that. Right. And so I think that's why I also feel more excited about interacting with more parents, because I don't get I am deeply entrenched in disability communities, but most of the disabled people I interact with are adults. And it was only through getting introduced to the mom group and there's someone named Kelly Coleman who wrote a book called Everything You Need to Know about parenting your disabled child, that I started to get brought into some more of these parents groups, because I have, and actually I think I may have said this on another podcast, but I do think about what I wish my mom had known when I became disabled. And I think one was that getting what I need was just like the benefit of access and accommodations. I think that was maybe the first. But then the second, and this one is one I'm still trying to figure out, but disabled kids grow up to become disabled adults. And I was recently talking to someone who is the mom of an autistic kid, and she has shared with her kid that she shared with the kid that the kid is autistic, so that the kid has that language, but also can determine how much they want to share or not. When I was growing up, I actually didn't know the formal name of my paralyzed arm, which is called a brachial plexus injury. I just knew it as my funny hand. And now as an adult, I would not describe my body or anyone else's body as funny unless they invited me to it. Because I was calling it my funny hand, I gave people an invitation to call parts of my body and me funny, And so I think about the ways that we kind of, and I don't have any kids, so I should also preface with that. But I do think about the language that we equip kids with and how that carries into adulthood, and whether there may be some devaluing there, right? Because I don't know, maybe my left arm. Yeah, I don't know. I remember watching an old video where I said, "This is my funny hand," and I was like, I don't want. I mean, now I just call it my paralyzed arm or my disabled arm, but yeah, I don't know. I'm now looking back and thinking about some of that language that I used, and how now as an adult I probably wouldn't have used that language.
It's interesting. Finding Nemo, right? Nemo has one of his flippers which is misformed.
Fins. Yeah,
one of his fins, and they allude to it, and yet they don't really highlight it. You know what I mean? They obviously talk about it, but they don't.
Yeah.
So it's there. So they created some awareness without creating a stigma around it, which I thought was powerful. Sean, you were going to say something. I'm going to interrupt you.
Well, a couple of things. I was going to say we are just who we are, and we all are the sum total of our life experiences, which is why we have to continue to ask questions and continue to be curious. And there is a thin line between accommodations and then being catered to or pandered towards. I made a post. I saw something the other day on social media. I made a post about it, and it kind of struck me, especially as a Black person of color. There was someone who was mentoring a young adult, and this person is on the autism spectrum, and the person that's mentoring them was talking to them about getting appropriate accommodations by letting it be known that they have autism. They didn't want anybody to know. And as a Black person, I'm very familiar with people in American history, quote unquote, light-skinned Black people passing for white because everybody just wants to be accepted. Maybe it's too much of a challenge to deal with things at that point in time, but I never heard of anyone passing as neurotypical. But it's just another example of the lengths to which people would go to just kind of blend in, be seen as far as, hey, I matter, but not comfortable with anything being drawn to them. And you have to respect where somebody is. But I have to imagine this individual is going to miss out on a couple of things that could make their life easier. And the person that's mentoring them made a post, asking kind of, what should I do? Because I know they may miss out on certain things, but this is where they feel. So, it's very interesting.
Yeah, one thing I'll share, and this conversation around disclosure is so sensitive, and it really is a personal journey. While you were speaking, I wanted to search. I did a quick search for something because I wanted to share. I just wanted to share something, and this is from a site called understood.org. And I'm just going to paraphrase it a little bit, but it says, accommodations, and this is related to school, but it says, accommodations don't change what students learn, nor does it change what job responsibilities people have. They change how people learn and how people get their work done. Accommodations also don't change the expectations for performance. They simply offer support to account for barriers or challenges that people may be experiencing. But all of that to say, I think this conversation, especially if you have disabilities that are not apparent, there is, and I think this is part of the unlearning as well, is that when someone hears the word disability, actually, the first unlearning is when someone hears the word disability, previously our society has attributed negative value judgment to it. You're broken. You need to be fixed. You're less than, right?
Yep.
Those are all ableist thoughts, right? The devaluing of disabled bodies and our minds. What would a neutral value judgment toward disability be like? Which is, I tell you I'm disabled and you say, okay, cool. Are there any accommodations you need to get your work done? Right. And so that's why I want to highlight, like, doesn't change what you learn, doesn't change what your job responsibilities are, and doesn't change your expectations for performance. It's just you may need something different, a different design variation for how you're getting your work done. But again, there still is part of the population that hears the word disability, thinks broken, thinks can't work, thinks isn't going to do your job well. Right. So if that's the narrative that we have internalized growing up, then how do we feel incentivized to want to ask for the support that we need if we think it's going to negatively impact our career trajectory in these places? All of that said, I mean, I'll just share one of my own stories, kind of related to work, but not. Actually, I'll share one work one. I'll share a random one and then so up until 18 years old, I still remember at my high school graduation, I walked down the line and I shook everyone's hands with my right hand, which is my paralyzed arm. I have very limited movement in my hand. It's like, in this claw thing, it's called the claw hand. That's actually a formal name of it. But there was some turning point that happened in college where I realized that just because everyone else shook their hands with their right hand, the way I was doing it didn't make me feel confident or empowered, nor did I feel like it was a good representation of who I was. So I shifted to becoming a very confident left-handed handshaker. And I'm very memorable because I shake hands with people with a hand that you're not used to. And some people, it's always like a fun dance with the hands. But I share that because, and actually, I guess it relates professionally because I was an ambitious university student. I was studying finance and accounting, and I wanted to get an internship. And if you want to get a job in finance, you have to go to these networking events. And so here I was, and I had to learn, in that split second of interacting with someone, they're going to determine if they want to build a deeper relationship with me. Like, how am I going to introduce myself? And is it going to be a fair representation of who I think I am and what I can contribute? In some ways, I feel very grateful that I wasn't hyper aware of how being disabled negatively impacts us when it comes to work. So I'll share two stats, and one is that, and I'm hoping these will change. So one stat is that the unemployment rate for disabled Americans is twice that of our non-disabled peers. The other stat is from the Society of Human, and that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The other stat is from the Society of Human Resource Managers. And it was a study that was done where they interviewed hiring managers and HR managers, and they asked, what's the reason why you didn't hire the disabled candidate, or you're not prioritizing disability inclusion in your recruitment process? And the top three answers were that they weren't sure if the disabled person could or couldn't do the job. Right on the outset, people are making assumptions about what they think I can or can't do. If someone made an assumption about Tiffany can, and I call this the assumption funnel. I'll give you some examples of the assumption funnel. It's Tiffany, this is a fact. Tiffany has a paralyzed arm. So we assume that we can't type. So we assume that she can't manage, she can't build financial models. So we don't hire her for the internship. So she doesn't get the job. We assume that a blind person, we assume that wheelchair users don't have any friends. So when we design our accessible seating in the venue, we don't make space for their companions to join them. So then the disabled person goes to the concert, but doesn't get to sit with their friends and doesn't get to deepen their connection with them. And you can think about how the assumption funnel kind of fills, like insert any assumption we make about a disabled person and the way that impacts, it has lasting impacts, right? We assume that a blind person isn't going to apply for this job. So we don't make the application accessible to screen readers. so the blind person doesn't apply, right? And I think a lot about how, in some ways I feel grateful that I wasn't aware of some of that data that was out there, because I was ambitious
Sure.
and going to all those networking sessions. And I did so many internships, because then it gave me an opportunity to show you what I can or can't do.
Sure.
And I think about now, 15 years into my career, you can't take my experience at Goldman or Bloomberg or some of these other places away from me. Like, I think about people who are earlier on in their career who might not have that level of safety, or don't have those receipts yet or that experience yet, and just want that first opportunity, but don't know if asking for accommodations will impact, or sharing that they have a disability will impact whether they get the job or not. So those are some of the dynamics that still exist. I forget what we were talking about. Because we were talking about accommodations. We were talking about accommodations and the mentor sharing that the person should be more transparent about their disability. Right. I'll share one final stat with you. I have many stats. I have stats on the positive side too that showcase the business case for disability inclusion. Companies are more profitable overall. We're seeing some companies start to. I share an example in the book where Victoria's Secret designed a bra that clasps in the front for people like me who can only use one arm. Right.
Wow.
And here we are. And it's a wow, but it's also, I remember being in a panel where she was introducing that this adaptive line of underwears and bras were coming out. And I know this is very specific and not maybe for your audience, but how was it that it wasn't until like 2023 or 2024 that we thought about the fact that people who can only use one hand would still need to wear a bra?
That was my wow. I wasn't even saying wow because it's great. I was like, wow, I didn't think of that, like, because it's not my experience. And again, why would it take that long? But that is a part of our audience too, though.
I will say, someone asked the chief diversity officer at the time, she said, hey, why are you creating this adaptive line? And she said, there's a business case for it. Right. And so I think a lot about the business of disability inclusion. But the final stat I'll share to kind of wrap this conversation around accommodations and disclosing and asking for what you need is there was some research done by Accenture. And when you get your books, which I know you will soon, you can dig into all of this research as well, because I think it's the research plus narrative that's going to create the type of change that we're hoping for. But the research is from Accenture from a couple years ago. I think it was 2020. And 4 out of 5, so 76 to 80% of disabled employees are not transparent about their disabilities at work. So 4 out of 5 disabled employees do not feel a level of psychological safety to be able to be more transparent about it. I want to trust that that is changing, as, again, that there are more role models, that we have people like Richard Branson talking about dyslexic thinking and the skills that we are all able to bring into our workplaces.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's amazing.
That's a long TED Talk. I apologize.
No, it's all great. And we're getting close to the end of the episode, and so probably a good spot for us to talk. I was going to say Elon Musk also mentioned the fact that he has Asperger's, and that created a big awareness for his outside the box thinking, and that, some people was like, oh, that makes so much sense. Yeah, Sean, you could say something before we.
I was just going to say, before we go to the question, because we're at that point, it may have us run slightly over, not sure. But what we didn't talk about, and I have made a note of it, I actually have a page and a quarter of notes and everything that we've been going through here, is, Tiffany, tell us about Diversability.
Diversability. Okay, so part of
That's
how
your nonprofit.
Part of how I think ableism gets its power is by making us think we have none. And part of how we think we don't have any power is by making us intentionally isolated and alone. And disabled people, your disabled kids, are some of the most isolated and excluded kids. I think about PE class, gym class I had to take, and no one made any. I did not learn about adaptive sports until I was in my late 20s. And now actually my fun fact is I'm on the USA Paraclimbing National Development Team, and just about ready to go to an international competition. Take that, gym teacher. But anyway, so part of how we tackle ableism in some ways is by building our power. And I do that through Diversability. So at a baseline level, Diversability is this nonprofit that is a community focused on elevating disability pride, building disability power, and advancing disability leadership. All of those words are very intentional because I think there are a lot of disability awareness organizations, but I think you can still be aware of disability and believe that we're broken or need to be fixed or we're less than. Disability pride is like, I'm here, I'm existing in all of the aspects of who I am, and acknowledging that disability does impact the way I navigate the world. I can't just forget about it, and it doesn't make me any less of a person. So we focus on what I like to call the shame to pride transformation for people in the disability community, because all of us are unlearning some internalized shame. I know that I went on that journey myself, and I will say that now I feel so liberated just being myself. I can go to a restaurant and order the steak and tell the server, like, hey, if it's okay, can they pre-cut it? Or if my friend is with me, they already know, versus trying to, and I will say I spent many years. I don't know if you've ever tried to cut a steak with one hand. It's difficult. Not recommended. But right, I think about, like, did I have to make things so hard, right? In this, because I was sitting in my shame that I felt like I needed to hide that, hey, I may need some support to help cut this steak. So we do that. And so we host virtual events every single week. And to me, my 2 wins I have from running Diversability. So we started in 2009 as Georgetown's first ever disability student club. We reemerged and incorporated in 2015 timeframe. At the time, I was a young professional, so we wanted to be like a group for young professionals. And now that I'm a millennial in my late 30s, we've kind of captured like the Gen Z and the Gen X cushions around us as well. How can we find out that we're not alone and then find our voice? Because once we find our voice, we become not only powerful advocates for ourselves, but for other people as well. And that's what we're hoping to do at Diversability, is create more Tiffany's in a way. Create more people who can show the possibility of what it looks like when we're included, and included with dignity and agency and respect. And yeah, we've grown our ecosystem to, what is it, over 80,000 the last time I was tracking. And I will say we do some informal surveying where we ask people to identify, and you can choose to answer or not. And about 65 to 70% identify as disabled, when if you look at that number of self-disclosure rates in corporates, that number's around like 3%, right? So can we create more spaces where people do feel comfortable showing up in a space? There's no one's forcing you to do any. Our group is actually open to disabled and non-disabled people. That's actually how I met Kelly, because she was writing her book and she wanted to make sure she wasn't using ableist language and, kept it disability centered, and got to meet so many people in the community. And so we're all learning from each other. And I think I'm learning too. I don't want to come in here and try to like assert superiority, which is why I wanted to have a conversation around language and kind of the embedded beliefs behind that, and what it might take for us to unlearn. Because honestly, unlearning some of that is really hard. It's a pattern interruption of
learning anything
that we've been fed and so much.
Wow.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kelly's a friend of the show. We've had her on a couple times. We've had lunch with her. We enjoy spending time with her.
Yeah, I contributed to her book. She's been on here twice, I think. Yeah, good people know good people.
And I think that this conversation and the folks that you've mentioned are all people that we're all now, our intersection. I sit on the board of We Are Brave Together. It's the intersection of all of these conversations. It's starting to rev up. I think that's the benefit of all.
And we're all starting to find each other and build our power together.
For sure.
There you go.
Sure.
Brian, go ahead.
No, you asked the question.
Our ability to change the world is based on our ability or our willingness to change ourselves. So with that in mind, give us just one example of a thought or belief. I should say another one, because you did earlier. A thought or belief that you once believed to be true strongly, but no longer believe to be true.
Ooh. So I'll have 2 answers to this. One is more of a Cliff Notes version of what I expressed earlier in this conversation. which is that I believed I was broken because I was in a disabled body. And that is something I held on to until I was in my early 20s, right? We went in depth about that. But I think the other thing I'll share is I think that if I look at everything that I have achieved, my greatest accomplishment is that I like myself. And I don't know if that's the direct answer to your question.
No,
but
that's gold.
That has taken, I guess, the unlearning, the belief. I had so much self-loathing as a kid. And I actually think that's why I'm so passionate about this work and this community and seeing the wholeness and value and worthiness in it just by existing. Because I see us as magic. I see us as a generative force. I see the ways that we show up for each other and how, those of us who are disability advocates are movers and shakers and the ways we support each other. And I'm like, I have a hard time seeing that as broken. We're just different, and may need a little support here and there, just the same way that other people may need support. And if we can, I call it removing like the friction. If we can remove the friction from having to ask for permission to show up in spaces, I think it'll just make things better for everyone. But yeah, short answer to your question is lots of accomplishments that I think most parents would be proud of any of their kids accomplishing. But the greatest one is that I look in the mirror and I feel proud of who I am and I like how I'm showing up in the world.
That's first of all, such a beautiful answer. And also we've been talking a lot lately about the telepathy tapes that came out in September with Kai Dickens and the idea that all of a sudden we're seeing nonverbal autistic adult speakers, actually speakers of all age, non-speakers of all age, and the value that they bring to a conversation. The reality is they're a blessing because they've allowed us to experience a higher level of consciousness to some degree, that where before I think that was an entire community of folks, again, discarded, pushed off as if this was perceived incompetence, when the reality is it's the opposite. So that's, I think, also in the conversation right now, in the gestalt, if you will, of people seeing that there's so much value that every person brings, regardless of what their physical abilities or limitations may look like. So that is so beautiful. We've been speaking with Tiffany Yu, CEO of the Diversability nonprofit, author of the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, TED speaker. You've done so much and are such an amazing advocate for this community. I'm grateful for you being here and being in this conversation today. We went a little long, but it was so worth it for us to go a little bit long to share the gold that you've given us today. Really, thank you for being here. It's been amazing.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Good.
As we wrap up this show.
Sorry.
I always wonder what it'd be like to have a podcast with two hosts. Like, how do you coordinate who
well, it's
says
funny.
what?
Yeah, we do have it, but sometimes we like to step on each other's toes. As we wrap this episode, I always say that empathy and love is always seems more important today than it even did yesterday. And look at somebody's situation with some empathy. Hey, I don't know what they're going through or what they're experiencing or what they're dealing with. So be empathetic to somebody's situation. And if you look at the world through the lenses of love, the world's just a much more beautiful place. And again, Tiffany, it's such a pleasure to be in this conversation with you. We feel completely honored that you've given us this time, and want to thank folks for listening in. And if you have any questions or want to reach out to Tiffany, Tiffany, there's a contact on your website, tiffanyyu.com, TIFFANYYU.com. There's 2 Y's in there, tiffanyyu.com, where people can reach out to you. And so again, thank you. I'll throw it to Sean to close us out, and thank Billy Footwear for being a part of our podcast on a regular basis. Again, we're talking about an individual who took his personal situation and created adaptive footwear. It was the one thing he was not able to do after being paralyzed in an accident, and he created an amazing company that does adaptive footwear for people of all ages, sizes, and abilities. And so we love you, Billy, and we also want to talk about the Den, the men's group that we do every other week. We do a Zoom. There's no cost to join. It's just men getting together and talking to each other for an hour about the kinds of things that we were talking about today. I'm going to throw it to Sean to close us out. And Tiffany, thank you again for being here today. It's been amazing.
Yes, there'll be a link in the show notes for a discount on your purchase with from Billy Footwear, as well as a registration link for the Den, which is free, along with the words I usually close with. I have to add something additional. I saw a post that actually my wife shared it with me the other day, and someone was on a Lewis Howes podcast, and they were saying it is not our job to make our children happy. We're not responsible for their happiness. And that hit me like a ton of bricks, because I've always said for any parent, your biggest challenge is to strike a balance between giving your child fish and teaching them to fish. Well, regardless of what one's belief is in terms of where we go when we leave here, wherever your father is, he is happy and he is proud, not because you're amazing and this force and all of that. Yeah, that's the small part, but the big part is because you've accomplished what so many people struggle with, which is that you like yourself. That's huge. So you've done him proud. And what the show is about, what we're about, we hate to see people not seen, not counted. And in a way, you've just humbled me here today and awakened something that I thought was wide awake in me in terms of just making sure that other people are seen, including my son. So thank you so very much for being here today. Remember that everybody needs the same thing. We need to be seen. We need to be heard. We need to know that we matter and that we're loved. Questions are more powerful than statements. Let's be a little more childlike and less childish. And to everyone within the sound of my voice, we know you have other choices. Thank you for being here. We love you.
Thanks again, Tiffany.
Thank you.
See you next week. Another episode of Just Two Dads.